This is going to be a very brief video in which I discuss the idea of ions. Now, this isn't necessarily a periodic trend, but we need to understand what an ion is before we discuss the rest of the periodic trends. So an ion is an atom that has a positive or negative charge. And we know from when we learned back in the last unit about atomic structure that atoms are typically electrically neutral, and that's because they have the same number of protons as electrons. Okay, but it's said that we'll soon learn what we call it when there are a different number of electrons, and that is what an ion is. An ion is formed when atoms either gain or lose electrons. So remember, we had the term isotope, which means an atom of the same element with different number of neutrons. An ion is actually an atom of the same element with different numbers of electrons. So they have gained or lost electrons. Now, if we look at a common example, and I'm showing an example of sodium and chlorine. So sodium and chlorine are coming together, and sodium has one electron in its outermost shell. So it's in the first column of the periodic table. It has 11 electrons. So 2 in the first shell, 8 in the second, and the 1 in the last. And it really wants to have only 8 electrons in its outermost shell, so it has 1 to give up. Chlorine has 17 electrons. So it has 2 in the first, 8 in the second, and 7 in the third. So it really wants to pick up an electron so it can have an outer shell that is full. Okay, so what ends up happening is the two will form ions when they're near each other. Sodium has 1 electron to give, and chlorine has 1 electron to take. So sodium will give its electron to chlorine, forming a sodium and a chloride ion. Okay. Now, as sodium loses an electron, it loses a negative charge. Okay, so it becomes positive because originally it had 11 protons and 11 electrons. When it gives up an electron, now it has 11 positive protons and only 10 negative electrons, so it has a net positive charge. Chlorine, on the other hand, chlorine has 17 protons and 17 electrons. It takes an electron, so it gains a negative charge, so it becomes negative. It now has 18 negative electrons and 17 positive protons for a net charge of -1. Alright, so metals on the left-hand side of the periodic table, they tend to lose electrons. Okay, so sodium, like in the example we just looked at, sodium is going to lose 1 electron. Okay, it now has 11 positive protons, 10 negative electrons, and therefore is +1, has 1 more plus charge than it does negative. When we form a positively charged ion, it's called a cation. Okay, and then we write it by putting the symbol and then putting the charge that it has. So in this case, sodium has a +1 charge. And we name it a sodium ion. We say it's a sodium ion. Now, nonmetals, they tend to gain electrons. They have a lot of electrons in their outermost shell, so they only need a few to be full. So they tend to gain 1 or more electrons. When they gain electrons, like chlorine did in our example, when it gained 1 electron, now it has 18 negative electrons, 17 protons, so its net charge is really a -1. Okay, so we would write it with a Cl with a 1- to show the charge, and we actually rename it a chloride ion. We take the root of the word chlorine and add an IDE to the end, and we say it's a chloride ion. Now, a positively charged ion, a metal that gives up an electron, we call it a cation once it's given up that electron and has a positive charge. The negative ions, the nonmetals that gain electrons and then therefore have a negative charge, we call them anions.